thank you for coming. It's a great honor to have you here. Given the fact that you actually woke up at 7 o'clock or even earlier, it is a great indicator that you are very much interested in this topic. And hopefully we will discuss some interesting issues with our guest, Professor Michael Giangreco, who you had a chance to listen as a keynote speaker, and also some of you had a chance to listen to him at the Faculty of Educational Sciences where we had one lecture. So we are expecting this to be an interactive event where you can ask any kind of questions that you have in your mind for the professor. And hopefully we will do it with a cup of coffee. So we can talk more and be more engaged. And I will abuse my position as a moderator, and I will ask the first question to the professor. So we are glad for the 100th time that we have you here. It's a great honor. And as many of these people are actually special educators, I would like to ask you, is special education as a service necessary for successful inclusion?
My opinion is that it is in our current system. We would have to be way more advanced where all teachers are trained in special ed and in general ed. And even then, I was talking to these folks who work with children who have blindness and visual impairment. There's such a specialty set of skills related to visual impairment or related to teaching children who are deaf, like knowing sign language, that lots of times even general special educators don't have that skill. So when it comes to teaching students that have very mild disability, I think it almost could be faded in that way, because the difference between a student that doesn't have a label and one that has a very mild learning disability is such that in some countries already regular education teachers teach those students successfully. But in general, I would say yes. And one of the things I learned yesterday talking to some of you, I think it was one person here, it was your group, that you were telling us about the number of schools that are covered. My opinion is that you would need more special educators than you have currently in order to have the kind of success
Just
you want.
to kind of shortly explain to the group, because like one of our colleagues who is working in the mobile team for supporting inclusion said that she's working in 5 schools covering thousands of students with and without disabilities, and in US the ratio is what?
Well, it varies from state to state and school to school, but what we're finding as a kind of an optimal place to be is about 1 special educator for every 100 children in the school, not children with disabilities, about 100 children in the school, based on the notion that of those maybe there might be 12 or 13 that have a disability. So but caseloads vary widely from school to school, but yeah.
So if the school has like 500 students, then it would have 5 special educators employed. That's the optimal ratio, more or less.
Ballparks, yeah. It varies, and also it varies based on the economics of the school. So for example, schools that have high poverty, lots of refugee children who speak different languages and have disabilities, those schools typically need more help.
So actually the ratio would be maybe 1 to 80 instead of 1 to 100.
In some cases it's 1 to 60 in some schools. Yeah. Again, this is 1 special educator for every 60 students in the school, not 60 students with disabilities.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And now we will let our audience ask questions. Before asking questions, please tell us your name and the institutions that you come from, and then, of course, pose a question to our professor. So, any volunteers?
Yes, just to break the ice. My name is Alexandra Karowska-Ristovska. Skopje. I'm an associate professor at the Department of Special Education and Rehabilitation from the University in Skopje. It's on faculty of philosophy, actually. So my question is, I won't go into our background about inclusion. I believe that the process is similar to here. Maybe we have more special educators in schools. I would like to hear your opinion on educational assistance, because somehow our governments in the past years, our Minister for Education thought that the best way is to put a person sitting next to the child, and it's one-on-one actually. In Macedonia. So I would just like to, I mean, I've been to the States, I was a Fulbright visiting scholar to the George Mason University. So I know
Recently?
how, 2018, 2019, before COVID. Yeah. That's my question. I probably know the answer, but just like another perspective, why is it not good
Yeah.
as a model?
Yeah. So let me back up a little bit with some history. About 25 years ago, I was doing some research around the use of related services like physical therapy, speech pathology, occupational therapy. And I was doing, this was around students with more intensive needs, severe disabilities, and I was doing a lot of classroom observations. And I was collecting data on these classrooms, and one of the things I observed that I wasn't there to see necessarily, but I couldn't help but see, was the one-to-one assistance and the kind of impact those one-to-one assistants were having. And as a result of that, our team wrote an article, a research study, qualitative, that was in Exceptional Children, that was called something, if I remember, like Helping or Hovering, Effects of Instructional Assistant Proximity. And in that article, one of the things that we identified was this list, and I shared some of it yesterday, inadvertent detrimental effects of having an assistant assigned one-to-one. And it's very problematic for a number of reasons. I think the most problematic reason is that it encourages the teacher to not be engaged with the student, the regular education teacher. The regular education teachers actions and attitudes towards, this is my student who I'm going to teach, is part of my class, is very important. And when we have the one-to-one, it's too easy for the teacher, and understandable, that the teacher would be like, yeah, I'm going to take care of the rest of these students and this person is covered. But it has so many other problems. And one of the things that study, which came out now, it was a long time ago, it was 25 years ago, was a demarcation point in the literature. Before that point in the literature, it was assistants are great, we just need to do a better job with the assistants. We just need to train them more. We just need to clarify their roles better. We just need to supervise them better. We need to compensate them, pay them better. And it was at that point that people around the world had started doing some similar studies. So there were studies that came out of Iceland, and I'm trying to remember where else. The Iceland one jumps to mind, but several other countries, people did research, certainly in Canada, showing these same detrimental effects. And it's definitely a problem. The thing that gets confusing in schools for us is sometimes the work that our group has done, I feel, is being misused. So, for example, sometimes school administrators in the United States who want to just cut services, they say, oh, Giangreco's research says don't use assistants. And it's like, no, that's not what it says. In fact, one of the things that we've been very clear about is to say, if you are going to reduce an assistant service, you should be looking at how to replace it with a better alternative. So what's a better alternative, not just cut? So you won't find anywhere in our literature where we recommend just cut that, don't do that because it's not good. It's like, what are you going to do differently, better? Are you going to change the ratio of special educators and increase special educator support, or co-teaching, peer supports, assistive technology, supports for the regular classroom teacher? What are you going to do that is an alternative that's better? So the thing is, and again, if that Maslow's Hammer article, I'm happy to have you share it with anybody, but we did a recent article, there was a special issue of the European Journal of Special Needs Education last year, and I wrote an article in there, part of which is titled Maslow's Hammer. And if you're not familiar, you're familiar with Abraham Maslow, I know, but Maslow's Hammer is the idea that something he said, which is if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to treat everything as if it were a nail. And so in the US, we tend to use assistants like Maslow's Hammer. You know, every problem we have, we think we can solve by assigning an assistant.
If I may add to this, so for example, the role of assistants, in your view, you do not see them as having an instructional role to instruct students.
Well, they could have an instructional role, but if they do, they don't have to. And in many schools, for example, in Italy, they don't have an instructional role. But if they do have an instructional role, their instructional role should be supplemental and secondary to the first instruction and primary instruction that's coming from a highly qualified teacher or special educator. And it's really interesting. I don't know how strong labor unions are here, but so in the UK, where there's a strong labor movement, if you look at some of the historical literature on assistants in the UK, I found some really interesting language where it would say things like, it would be scandalous to have an assistant engage in instruction, right? Because that's the role of the teacher. And of course, in a kind of a labor way of thinking about things, you want the highest skilled, highest paid worker doing the work. But why is it that then in education, like in the US, the highest skilled workers, the teachers, say, I don't really want that work, you know? An assistant, I don't really want that work. And some of it is our fears, as I mentioned yesterday, our kind of apprehensions about working with students with disabilities.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we'll go to the next question. Our colleague broke the ice, so that's a good thing. Now let's go to the second question. Now you have coffee, so you can.
My name is Tijana, and I'm coming from Faculty of Education in Croatia. Actually, I'm a pedagogue. I'm not a speech therapist or anything. But what I liked yesterday in your lecture was this that we all need actual inclusion. Everyone has some special needs, each of us, and that's the ground where we should start. We did the research. I'm preparing kindergarten teachers, and in Croatia we did some project where we tried to analyze the study programs in Croatia for kindergarten teachers. How much is inclusive? And we realized that it was not very inclusive. And then we wondered, okay, we are preparing kindergarten teachers who next day will be in practice, and we as teachers and faculty, we are not enough inclusive. And that was not good for us, but this made us think what we can do to make things better. We need to start to make our students, kindergarten teachers, teachers in primary schools, secondary schools, more inclusive, more aware of the importance of inclusion. And that's the question also of the values. What you were saying yesterday, that's the question of value, the society, the values, what we think it's okay and what we think it's not okay. And it's strange, I have to say, in Croatia. We have our new generations more and more closed, not so open for others. They are more and more closed, and that's what worrying me in this moment. How will they work one day when they have children in their groups, kindergarten groups, primary school classes, children with any kind of special needs. So I think that we need to do more with, let's say, mainstream schools, mainstream kindergarten teachers about the awareness and the importance.
So, you know, it's interesting you mentioned kindergarten, because the United States has been working on this since the mid-1970s, and we're going slow, making progress, but very slow. And then in some states we make progress and then we slide back, or school districts make progress and we slide back. And so, you know, now it's been, 45 years or so, more than 40 years, and I think if we started with kindergarten, right?
Yes.
And we just said, we're gonna make an effort to make the best inclusive experience in kindergarten for all of our students. And then we gradually said, okay, now we're gonna do kindergarten first grade, kindergarten first second, and just keep moving up. You know, we could maybe do some stuff at the upper grades, but some students in reality are gonna go through the system the way that it is. But if we made a concerted effort to start with kindergarten and then never stop, in 15 years you could have the best inclusive,
Yeah.
in the world, I mean, and your point about how we prepare teachers is really important. I was explaining to the students at the university a couple days ago that our regular education teachers are all required to take at least a little bit of coursework
Yes,
in
we also
special
have that.
education, but it's about like this. But because, at least in Vermont, in the state that I live in, it's one of the more inclusion-oriented states. So many students with disabilities are in general education that many of the students know that it is an advantage to them in terms of employment if they have more special education coursework. And so we have a minor program in special education. So lots of times they'll take elementary or secondary education, and then they'll minor in special education, and they might take 5 or 6 courses in special education. And then when they go for a job, they go to the top of the list, of people that might be hired.
Yeah, we have some similar things. They have opportunity for some subjects to try to do some community work and volunteer in some NGOs that are working with different kind of children and people, and that's what we say. Okay, this is very good. We can take this for part of your course, so that you pass the course just because you did some community work, and it's.
But that preparation of, one of the things that it makes me think of is, it's funny that things that, in some ways we've made progress, and in other ways we're still moving very, very slowly all across the world. And in the early 1990s, which I realize is ancient history to some of you, but maybe not so much to some others of you. You know who you are.
Still recognize
Some very prominent researchers at the University of North Carolina in early childhood special education did a study where they looked at the comfort of regular education preschool teachers. And they basically identified that that a certain portion, many regular education preschool teachers were not comfortable with the presence of students, particularly that had more significant disabilities. And one of their conclusions was that we should be sensitive to the fact that they're not comfortable. And that, you know, maybe we shouldn't put this on them. And then the editor of the journal asked myself and a professor from the University of Washington to write a commentary on this article. And part of my commentary was about extending the comfort zone, and that it's not okay to deny a child an education, an appropriate, inclusive education, because I'm not comfortable, you know? So it's like, and this is part of what I was trying to get at yesterday, about whether we include students or whether we're successful at including them isn't about whether they have a disability. We can include anybody we choose to include. It might be hard, might be messy, but we can include pretty much almost everybody, or hopefully in the future, everybody that we choose to include. It's us. It's how we think about it, you know, and so we have to challenge it. We have to challenge things all along the way. And it's like, I don't know if you remember, like the second or third last slide that I showed was a person in a wheelchair chained to the wall. And what are the things that they're chaining? The concept that, you know, none of us are free if one of us is chained. And so, you know, and this whole idea of, if you see an injustice, and it can be a big injustice or it can be a small injustice, but if you let it go, if you don't confront it in some way, you're complicit in it, you're encouraging it. And I thought it was so interesting when we were doing the paperwork with the U.S. Embassy, and you probably didn't even see this. The U.S. Embassy that partially paid for this trip, they have to fill out a lot of paperwork. And one of the things they have to do is they have to connect what I'm doing here with the goals of the embassy. And I thought it was really interesting, they linked it to objectives about encouraging inclusive society. And so, you know, one of the things, regardless of what anyone's background is, you know, whether, no matter what country from the former Yugoslavia they're in, no matter what their religious background, disability doesn't discriminate. You know, people who are Croatian and Serbian and Macedonian and Bosnian, they all have children with disabilities. If they have conservative or liberal politics, they can still have a child with Down syndrome. It crosses everyone, right? So, and everybody has an interest in seeing their child or their grandchild or whatever, you know, be treated well. And so it's important.
I hope that answers your question, Tiana.
Yes.
I'll ask you one more question before moving to the public. Actually, my question regards the elements of choice. For example, we all embraced the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, promoting, especially Article 24, that promotes inclusive education. And that's a matter of social justice, as you said, it's a question of balance. But what in the case that, for example, we have some parents who want their children to go to special schools?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So how do we deal with that?
Yeah. So we have the same questions and issues of parents at home. One of the reasons, I mean, it's more complicated than we have time to fully talk about, but when you talk to parents in the US anyway, who say, I want my child to go to a special school, oftentimes it's because they're afraid. They're afraid that if their child goes to a regular school, their needs won't be met, that they'll fall through the cracks, that they will be bullied, that something negative will happen. And in some cases, they are right.
Justified.
Yeah, some cases they are right. And so their instinct is protective, as, you know, many parents, yeah, you're gonna wanna protect your child. So it's important for us to understand that, but it's also, we do have situations in the US based on our law where schools are actually winning legal cases where families are like, I want you to pay to send my child to this private separate school for autism, let's say, and the school is saying, we have the capacity to appropriately educate your child here. And from a legal perspective, the school is winning, so to speak. But you don't want to be there, you want to be able to say to parents, we're going to work with you and collaborate with you to do the right thing for your child.
So the law does not stipulate the best education, but
appropriate
education.
Yeah,
So
not
that
the
can
best.
be variously explained.
Yeah, and there was a big change in our law based on a ruling from our Supreme Court recently. It used to be when one of the problems with appropriate versus best was sometimes what some people thought was appropriate was referred to as minimus, just like,
Minimum.
yeah, very minimal. And now there was a new Supreme Court ruling which basically got rid of that and basically said, no, you have to have a high standard for these children in the regular school. You can't just like put them there and not really attend to them.
And in line with that, is there anything that you would change in IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for example, right now?
The big, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, there's many excellent provisions in it, and on the other hand, it's highly bureaucratic. It's the amount of time and effort, but the problem is, it's there to protect the worst situations, but the people who are doing the right things, doing good things, they still have all of the burden of all of the paperwork and all the regulations and all the rules. I mean, it's the rule, there's the law, and then there's a stack of regulations that goes with the law, and it's a lot. It'd be nice if it were streamlined, simplified, but what it will take more regular education teachers and administrators to follow through where we won't need that, but for now, it's needed.
That's what we have. Okay, thank you. Let's move to the another question. Do we have?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dragan. I'm from North Macedonia, and I work in a early intervention center, mostly with children with autistic spectrum disorder. As assumed before, we joined few projects where we were, let's say, pushed for total inclusion. And also, I'm sure you've heard about the projects in Italy in the small cities where they try to make total inclusion. So I just want to hear your opinion about that, because we all know it's hard, and I was thinking about where should we start so we can come to the goal, and the goal is total inclusion, and we have few issues in these projects because of the opinion of the parents and the opinion of the society.
Yeah, that's a big question. So your main question though is, where to start with including students with autism spectrum disorder?
It's not only autistic spectrum disorder. That's my field that I work, but
Yeah.
It's about totally about the inclusion.
Yeah, to me, even in the schools that I work with in Vermont, I've actually at home, I haven't done this here, but just because of the language, differences. But in my own literature and when I present at home, I typically don't use the word inclusive education. I use the term inclusion-oriented education. Do you understand the distinction?
Yes.
Inclusion-oriented are people who are striving toward inclusion, but to say that this school is inclusive, because people want to come visit Vermont and they say, show me these amazing inclusive schools. And I have to say to them, we're going to go to a school and you're going to see things that you think aren't good, that could be much better. But this is a school that is striving toward inclusion. They recognize the limitations that they're experiencing, and they're trying to move in a more positive direction. So to me, it's a more fair characterization to say that a school is inclusion oriented, because inclusion is kind of like justice, right? You never really fully 100% ever get there to be fully inclusive, right? So, and then that becomes one of the problems that I talked about yesterday, which is where people will be like, well, if that's inclusion, you know, and then they're looking at something that they think is not good practice, and it's labeled inclusive because a child is physically present. Being physically present is not enough. So one of the problems we have in Vermont is that the state and the schools have gotten so much positive attention for including students in the school that people think that they're up here. And it's like the school administrator maybe recognizes that there's an issue that needs more attention, and they might invite somebody like me to come in to work with them, and the teachers are like, why are you here? Don't you know? We're fantastic, we're inclusive, and they don't even recognize. And so there's two places that, even in schools that have the mentality that they're up here, there's two places that we almost always start as a starting point. One is to get everyone in the school on the same page of the book on what do we mean when we say inclusion. What do we mean if we are to be inclusion oriented? And for me, I start with those 7 elements that I shared with you yesterday. And we survey the faculty, and what we've, and remember do you remember the slide I showed you with the graph, that the bar graph, the side bar graph, and it got smaller and smaller and smaller percentage? You know, that came from data where we work with people on like what their perspectives are on this. And you know, you'll have a teacher who thinks like, well, yeah, it's inclusion because the assistant is doing everything. That's inclusion. The child's in my class, you know. You don't expect me to actually teach this child, do you?
Well, she already has an assistant.
She has an assistant, right?
Yeah.
You know, and so the number one place to start, it's very simple, but it's the foundation, is those values that I talked about, inclusionary values, and then what are the actual elements that you could actually see and measure, and is everybody on the same page? Because then if the teacher's like, well, my job's not to actually teach, is it? My job is to be a host for you and the special ed people to do the work. And also, we don't want to say to the teacher, okay, teacher, you do everything, because the teacher's like, I can't do this by myself.